All right, continuing along, we are entering part 2 of Christ the Eternal Tao. We just finished with the 9 enads. I started going into it on our previous video, but it was cut off. So I'm going to start at the beginning again. So part 2 is titled The Unfolding Revelation of the Tao in Human History. Chapter 1 is titled Departure from the Way, and subsection is Pristine Simplicity. So in the beginning, man was created in a state of pristine simplicity, pure awareness. His thoughts and memories were not diversified and fragmented as they are today, but were simple and one-pointed. He knew no mental distraction. While being wiser than any human being today, he was in a state of innocence, like a child. And in this state, he lived in deep personal communion with God, the Tao, the Logos, and with the rest of creation, holding spiritual converse with them. Being in such a close communion with God, primordial man participated directly in God's uncreated energy, which he experienced as a divine and ineffable light which flooded his whole being. He was, as it were, clothed in the light. Primordial man possessed self-awareness, that is, he was aware of an I, of being a unique creation, endowed with freedom of will, made in the image of God, and had an immortal spirit that could draw eternally closer to his Creator. All of this gave him a special sense of personhood. Unlike the people of today, however, he did not have a sense of individuality. By this we mean that he did not live under the illusion that as a unique person he was sufficient unto himself. While possessing freedom, he did not have the false sense that he existed free of anything else, that he was non-determined. He was not conscious of being a separate, isolated self, but cleaved unto God in a communion of love and united all creation in love unto himself. Since he did not have diversified thoughts, but one simple, pure awareness, he did not identify himself with such thoughts, as we do today. And since he was not distracted by and enslaved to these senses, he did not identify himself with his physical body, as we do. Thus, for all the reasons, we can say that while being a person endowed with self-awareness, he was truly selfless. When he was still in the state of pristine simplicity, man always acted in accordance with nature, both in accordance with his own human nature, or human essence, and with the common nature of all creation. This is the same as saying that he acted only in accordance with the ordering, directing principle of all nature, the Tao, the Logos. His will, created pure by God, followed the Tao in all things, not out of necessity, as did other creatures, but freely, out of love. His freedom of will made him unique among all creatures, though not separate from them. This quality of freedom not only made for the possibility of his unique human personhood, it was also part of what made him in the image of God. As God is free, so likewise man is free. But between God and man, there remained a fundamental difference. God is entirely sufficient unto himself, self-existing, non-determined, unconditioned, standing in need of nothing. He is absolute possibility. Man, on the other hand, is conditioned by the very fact that he was brought into being not by himself. His very minute-by-minute existence, not only his creation, is dependent on God. The character of his existence is determined by his own God-given human nature, and by the common nature of the created order of which he is part. He has the ability to freely choose his actions within this determined, conditioned existence. If he chooses to act according to nature, and thus according to the Tao, who orders nature, all will go well. But if he does not act naturally, he gets out of harmony with both the Tao and with nature, and thus sets himself at odds with that which determines his very existence. As long as man, in his self-awareness, remains humbly aware that he does not exist of himself, that he of himself is nothing at all, he will do what is natural to him. He will do it freely, and at the same time automatically. That is, spontaneously, because his free will will naturally fall in line with the nature without his having to stop and consider anything. When man begins to harbor the illusion of self-sufficiency, however, he becomes a self, in the modern sense of the word, an individual desiring things for himself and pitting himself against other individuals. If such was the possible consequence of human freedom, why did God allow for it? It was in order to allow for love. Love must be freely given. It cannot exist without freedom. If God had not endowed the human essence with this quality, the world would be a cold, impersonal, entirely programmed environment. Subsection 2, the primordial departure. When man, in wrongly using his free will, first departed from the way, the Tao, he corrupted his primal simplicity and became fragmented. Divested of the primal glory of the garments of uncreated light that had enveloped him, he now found himself naked. His spiritual corruption and death made him subject to physical corruption and death. After his transgression, writes St. Macarius of Egypt, man's thoughts became base and material, and the simplicity and goodness of his mind were intertwined with evil, worldly concerns. His will became divided. Now his natural will, which remained inclined to follow the way in all things, was set against his free will, which had now taken on itself an inclination to depart from the way. Before his primordial departure from the way, man had experienced only that which was natural to him. Now, however, he also experienced that what was unnatural to him. Thus he self-willfully usurped the knowledge of good and evil, destroying the primal simplicity and bringing duality into the world. Before, man had been spontaneous, like a child. At every step, he freely chose, without thinking, to act according to nature, according to the way. Now, however, at every step, he had to stop and think, to calculate. Should I follow the way or not? Thus he became a complex being, inwardly divided and always vacillating. Only God is self-existent. When man began to fall under the illusion of being self-existent, a self-existent individual, he was essentially making himself into a little God. This was the meaning of the primordial trap into which he fell. Knowing good and evil, you will be as gods. Man had been created to rise in his simple and uncompounded nature in noetic contemplation of the simple and uncompounded God. To rise in love and to unite all of creation with himself in love, raising it also to the Creator. Instead of regarding the way, however, he chose to regard what was easier and closer at hand, his own visible self. Instead of rising with God, he fell in love with himself. Man had been meant to find pleasure in his limitless ascent to God and in loving communion with him, the source of all things. But in falling in love with himself, he began rather to seek pleasure from what was closer to him, his body and his senses. All evil in the world can be traced to these two things, self-love and love of sensual pleasure. Man had been created to desire God, the uncreated source of his joy, but in falling in love with himself, he had instead begun to desire created things. Because of all of this, God allowed suffering to enter the world. He did this not out of vengeance, but out of love for man, so that through suffering arising from self-love, sensual pleasure, and the resulting desire of created things, man might see through the illusion of his self-sufficiency and return to his original designation, the state of pristine simplicity and communion with the way. Subsection number 3, knowledge of God in the earliest historical cultures. After his primordial departure from the way, man as a whole was still more simple and innocent, closer to God and nature than he is today. Thus his knowledge of God was more pure. That is substantiated by records that have come down to us from earliest periods of ancient civilizations. The religion of Egypt's first dynasty, for example, was much more pure than the forms of polytheism that arose in later dynasties. Marcia Laud writes, quote, "It is surprising that the earliest Egyptian cosmogony, yet known as the most philosophical, for the supreme God, Thoth, creates by his mind, his heart, and his word, his tongue. In short, the theogony and cosmogony are affected by the creative power of thought and word of a single God. We here certainly have the highest expression of Egyptian metaphysical speculation. It is at the beginning of Egyptian history that we find a doctrine that can be compared with the Christian theology of the Logos." Unquote. The same is true for the primal period of Chinese civilization. The oldest book of Chinese history, the Shu Qing, Book of Documents, relates that in China's first dynasty, the Hisa dynasty, 2300 to 1700 BC, the people believed in one supreme God, whom they called Shang Ti. Shang meaning above, superior to, and Ti meaning ruler or lord. At this point, writes historian John Ross, quote, "The very threshold of what the Chinese critics accept as the beginning of their authentic history, the name of God and other religious matters present themselves with the completeness of a Minerva. We are driven to infer that the name and the religious observances associated with it are coeval with the existence of the people of China. It is therefore evident that the belief in the existence of one supreme ruler is among the earliest beliefs of the Chinese known to us. Of an earlier date, when no such belief existed, or when the belief of polytheism did exist, we find no trace. Nowhere is there a hint to confirm the materialistic theory that the idea of God is a later evolutionary product of a precedent belief in ghosts or departed ancestors, or that the belief had arisen indirectly from any other similar source. During the next dynasty, the Shang, 1700 to 1100 BC, the supreme deity was more commonly called the name Tian, meaning heaven, though the name Shangti continued to be used interchangeably with it, sometimes side by side. The Chinese emperor had to possess what was called the mandate of heaven, or the mandate of Shangti, which he earned by living and ruling virtuously. If he ever ceased to rule according to the way of heaven, he would lose the mandate and fall from power. This understanding of government remained intact in China until the early 20th century. In China's oldest book of literature, the Shi Qing Book of Odes, which dates from the middle of the Chu dynasty, 800 to 600 BC, we find such phrases as these, quote, "Great heaven is all intelligent and with you in every place. Great heaven sees all and is with you in your wanderings." Because King Wen served Shang-Ti with his whole understanding and received much blessing, he succeeded to the throne. He exhibited a virtue so perfect that the blessings received from Shang-Ti would, for his sake, descend to his successors. The founder of Shang dynasty received the blessing of heaven, and because of his virtue, heaven bestowed mercy upon him. The arrogant men are pleased, while the toiling men are anxious. Azure heaven, look at those arrogant men, pity these toiling men, end quote. Of all the primordial peoples of the Hebrews, the Chinese, all the primordial peoples save the Hebrews, the Chinese, together with their racial cousins, the native North Americans, retained the purest understanding of the one God, the Supreme Being. Nevertheless, even at the time of the first and second dynasties in China, much of man's original knowledge of God had been lost due to primordial departure. Heaven, although it guided and directed the affairs of men, was often seen as being painfully distant. In the Shi Qing, it is often referred to as the remote heaven. Only the emperors had the right to offer sacrifices to Shang-Ti heaven, and even they were frequently to lament that heaven is difficult to rely on. The Duke of Chu, 11th century BC, went far as to say, heaven, quote, "heaven cannot be trusted," end quote. In ancient China, as in other primal countries, we see a gradual movement from simplicity to complexity, as the effects of the primordial fall from the pristine simplicity became more fully entrenched in man's nature. Man was no longer merely asking, should I follow the way of heaven or not? Now he was asking, why is the way? What is the way? In becoming more distant from the Creator, the ancient Chinese sought out inferior deities, the spirits of their ancestors, the gods of hunting and agriculture, the spirits of the sky, the earth, the sun, moon, and wind. To seek out the will of heaven, they frequently resorted to divination, heating up a tortoise shell until it cracked, and then interpreting the message encoded in the cracks. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of such tortoise shells used in imperial divination dating from the Shang dynasty. From the inscriptions on them, it appears that the emperors never invoked the distant and awesome Shang-Ti heaven directly through the oracles, but only invoked the spirits of their ancestors as intermediaries. As centuries passed, the original monotheism of China continued to be obscured. Since the Chinese culture is so strongly based in tradition, however, the ancient religion could never disappear entirely. Above all, it was preserved in the state of worship. The emperor continued to offer the great sacrifice to Shang-Ti twice a year, at the winter and summer solstices, according to the ancient custom. This practice extended into modern times and ended only with the fall of the Manchus in 1911. Even from the popular mind, the ancient monotheism could not be completely eradicated. To Westerners, it is little known fact that China and Taiwan, even today, vestiges of the original Chinese religion are found in the Taoist and Buddhist temples. When people come to these temples, they burn incense and pray to Shang-Chi at a special place in the narthex, and only then do they enter the main temple area. Still, it must be concealed that much of the Chinese religion has descended to polytheism through the centuries, and that the worship of the one God, Shang-Ti, has been confused by pantheons of deities of various ranks. The same would have happened to in ancient Hebrew culture as happened in China, and at many times the Jewish history almost did happen. But God, through the prophets, continually called this people back to worship him alone. He intervened in this way because it was out of the Hebrew race that he was to be the one to take flesh and reveal the ultimate mystery of his being to the world. It's the end of the first chapter of this section. Chapter 2 is seeking the way of return, and we will continue next time. Thanks for listening.